Hi, my name is Eric Paglia, and welcome to the talk show at the World Water Week in Stockholm. In this talk show, we'll discuss how to move from calls for coordinated and holistic approaches towards the Sustainable Development Agenda to actually financing and taking actions that incorporate source-to-see thinking in project design, evaluation, and implementation. And joining me for this talk show, we have Ruth Mathews, Senior Manager at SIWI and Coordinator for the Action Platform for Source-to-See Management, and Martin Koehring, Head of the World Ocean Initiative and Senior Manager Sustainability at Economist Impact. Well, welcome to the talk show. Very nice to have you here to talk about Source-to-See. Now, Ruth, we're here to talk about how to unlock financing for Source-to-See action. Can you please explain why you advocate for Source-to-See actions?
So when I look at what's going on in the world right now, what I see is that we have a climate crisis, we have a biodiversity crisis, we have a crisis around water security, around the ocean, pollution, and these crises are not independent. They are actually interconnected. And so what we need to do is have a holistic approach to addressing all of the crises so that we can unlock the potential of investments and finance that will, and action that will layer different benefits across these different crises. So at SIWI, we have been developing this source-to-see approach, and we also host the Action Platform for Source-to-See Management, and we have more than 35 partners on this platform, and we all work together to work towards holistic management of land, freshwater, coastal, and marine environments. And the reason we do that is because the actions that we take in one location can have an impact elsewhere. And so when we're wanting to address and take action to move out of the spiral we're on right now of increasing humanitarian impacts from these different crises, we need to look through this source-to-see lens to find action that enables us to have the most benefit for people and nature from the investments we're making.
So this source-to-see thinking, that entails rather large spatial scales then?
It can. But it can also happen at a small scale. So for instance, you might be looking at that there's wastewater treatment that's needed in a small area, that's like a small town. But when you're thinking about how to accomplish that wastewater treatment, you can be thinking about, okay, so if we clean this water, it will improve the survival of mangroves downstream, or it can help fisheries be more profitable because they'll be healthier to eat. And so then you're only looking at the singular problem, but you're seeing it from this holistic view.
Very interesting. So Martin, your experience is more from the ocean part of the source-to-see system. And we've heard about the health of the ocean is dependent upon what happens upstream. What are some of the challenges you see in unlocking finance for action on land or in freshwater ecosystems that'll benefit ocean health?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, at Economist Impact, we talk a lot with investors and we talk a lot with the financial industry, and we partner with them as well, just to unlock and identify what the key challenges are to kind of unlocking finance for kind of more these holistic approach, as Ruth was saying. This is a holistic approach because you need to set up an institutional kind of frameworks for this kind of cooperation. So for example, we produced the Blue Peace Index, which is kind of looking at kind of transboundary water management issues. For example, looking at the Amazon River Basin, or we're looking at Mekong or the Senegal River Basin. And for these kind of challenges that are, these kind of river basins face, we need to have institutional cooperation. We need to work together. Different sectors need to work together. And that's what financial institutions need as well. They need an institutional framework that gives them predictability, that gives them some kind of a conducive policy environment. And another challenge is that those kind of sectoral silos. I mean, as Ruth was mentioning, we're facing a kind of triple crisis. We have climate change, we have biodiversity loss, we have pollution, plastic pollution, chemical pollution. And for that, we need to have these kind of sectoral cooperation. We have to have the water sector working with the agricultural sector, energy. At this conference, we talk a lot about the nexus, the water energy nexus, the water agriculture nexus. But there are lots of sectoral silos. So plastics industry often works in their own silos. The chemicals industry often, in terms of their intellectual property rights, and they're concerned about revealing exactly what kind of chemicals are released, because there's these silos as well. There's also a silo between cities and rural areas. We have the City Water Optimization Index that, for example, identified some of those kind of pain points. So for example, for Baku, in Azerbaijan, the main river there is drying up, and that's mainly because of agricultural overuse. So there needs to be this kind of cooperation between cities and agriculture as well. And the final challenge is the lack of awareness and data and high quality data on those kind of transition risks. So as we move from the climate crisis to also focus on biodiversity loss and pollution crisis, the same transition risks that companies face and that investors and financiers need to be aware of for climate, they also now need to be aware of for biodiversity and pollution. So things like policy changes, regulatory changes, legal risks for companies, technological risks, all these kind of things companies now need to be aware of, but they currently aren't. And on the flip side, they're also not as aware of the benefits of source-to-sea action. Like, for example, the value of the ocean economy, the value of the circular economy for plastics. So it's the risks and the benefits that companies and investors are not yet fully aware of.
And maybe I can interject here. One of the ways that I think about it and talk about it is source-to-sea challenges. And so what do I mean by source-to-sea challenges? What I mean is that these are challenges that cannot be solved by one location, one sector, one community, upstream or downstream, because they cross the source-to-sea continuum, is how we call it. And so there you really need to bring people together from the different sectors, from upstream and downstream, to be able to solve that challenge. And many of them that Martin mentioned in terms of chemical and plastic pollution, nutrients, the ways that we alter river courses with dams or levees or draining wetlands, all of these things have an impact that go beyond a specific location. Or to solve them, you need to have a bigger community of actors to come together. And so these source-to-sea challenges require this holistic approach, this source-to-sea approach, to be able to find the solutions that will be durable over time.
Perhaps you can say more about this holistic approach to source-to-sea.
So yes, what we've been developing is the tools and methods that can help people come together. So the different sectors to come together, the upstream and downstream communities to come together, and to build an understanding of the biophysical system. So what's going on, on the ground in the water, the social system. So who are the different stakeholders, and how are they? What are their interests and concerns and issues? The governance system. So what are the laws, regulations, strategy, policies that are informing either in a positive or negative way the way people are behaving? And you put those three together and use that to develop a shared vision amongst everybody, so that you can come to an action plan that everybody collectively can contribute to from their individual sector or from their community, so that we come to a broader solution set that includes this upstream, downstream, cross-sectoral viewpoint.
It really does sound like a really fantastic model or concept, but what really needs to change to achieve this sort of holistic approach?
Well, we really like to work in our knowledge strength, and so we tend to work in silos. And, I work in water and I really am comfortable in water. And maybe I don't want to think about land use or industrial development or, other areas that I am not so familiar with. And so what we really need to do is have a willingness to get out of our comfort zone and make those relationships, build the trust, build the ways of communicating with each other, find how we can coordinate our actions together. So it's a lot of trust and relationship building. But then it's also recognizing that the benefits that might come from an action by myself or someone else flow beyond that individual receiver. So for instance, benefits from source to sea actions can flow downstream, but they can also flow back upstream. So if we do something upstream that improves the coastal areas in terms of their ability to respond to storm surges, that can be a huge benefit for upstream. Fisheries can be improved, and that can be a benefit. So we start seeing these benefits that move both upstream and downstream to incentivize that coordination and cooperation towards a shared vision.
I agree that there's this, you mentioned the trust. It's so important. Building that trust between the different stakeholders, that's absolutely crucial. And we see that a lot in the work we do at the World Ocean Initiative. For example, you mentioned mangroves, mangrove restoration, seagrass. There are lots of co-benefits, like, further kind of upstream that are, often not appreciated in terms of the economic value that this creates, social values, jobs, and so on. But also in terms of innovation, business model innovation, financial innovation, like the blue bond that was done for, Belize and Seychelles. There's so much innovation that is happening when we have this value chain approach. And that's also one approach where business and finance can come into this conversation. Because now we have this for climate change. We're very much aware of the value chain because lots of companies, they have to report now on their emissions. So, these bigger companies, sometimes 90% of their emissions are in their supply chain. Now we're going to see the same thing happening for biodiversity and kind of nature as well as pollution. So this is coming. The investors are now demanding more and better data. We see this with CDP that is at this conference as well. They are now, starting to measure like water risks in the supply chain and so on. That value chain approach is really going to change and revolutionize this cooperation, building trust, because you need to have more transparent value chains if you want to build the coalitions and cooperation that you mentioned, Ruth.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the interesting things about when we talk about source to sea, because there's a way that initially it came from a very geographic perspective, land, freshwater, coastal, and marine. And, how do we work across that continuum in a way that is beneficial and creates the optimal outcome for the source to sea system as a whole. But now that circular economy is more, in the conversation and in our minds in terms of how can we reduce the amount of waste that we're having and really recycle into a resource and reuse it. You can also think about source to sea in terms of, from the initial resource into the design and the production and the selling and the use, and then what happens to it after at the end of life and how does it come back in. And one of the things that we've been looking at specifically with plastic pollution is that if you can include the geographical source to sea benefits of reducing plastic pollution, that actually increases the business case for investing in that circular economy infrastructure. And so they really, you can, they are interrelated in almost a way. I kind of picture these two gears that make things work more quickly and with a stronger incentive to take action, because the circular economy has benefits for the source to sea system geographically. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the benefits that there inspire more more investment in this in circular economy.
And just to add to that, there's lots of financial innovation now happening in exactly that space. So, for example, this idea of extended producer responsibility is all about the upstream in terms of the design of a plastic product. You already have to think about how you're going to deal with the waste, which is actually not really waste because you're putting it back and you put value back into the full supply chain. So extended producer responsibility is one way of connecting, the downstream and the upstream. And there's also, the plastics credits, for example, now that, you can sell plastics credits and then you can kind of invest the benefits of that into waste management infrastructure. So that's similar to what we have with carbon credits. So as I was saying earlier, what we have done with climate change and carbon emissions is slowly being replicated. So there will also be financial innovations around that for water, for nature, and for biodiversity and pollution.
You've done a great job outlining the concept of source to sea and the business case, making the business case for it. Perhaps now you can give some examples of how SIWI is working to implement source to sea and some of the lessons you've learned so far.
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity. So one of the places we've been working with the source to sea approach is in Vietnam, in a river basin, the Vu Gia Tavon River Basin in central Vietnam. And we initially started with doing an analysis of the sources of plastic pollution in the basin as a whole. And one of the things that came out was that while some of the urban areas had very they have more people, so you would think they would create more plastic pollution. In fact, they had very high collection rates and recycling rates, and so they were not releasing so much plastic pollution. However, the rural areas upstream, the coastal areas downstream were big sources of plastic pollution. So that was really informative of then that puts that source to sea question really central, because if you're going to solve the plastic pollution problem and prevent it, you can't just focus on investments in the urban areas. You need to distribute the investment into the areas where the needs are really there. And so then we moved to working with Hoi An, which is an ancient city, UNESCO heritage site, huge tourism draw that is downstream of these upland areas that anytime it rains, down comes all the plastic pollution, right? And we worked with them on an environmental strategy using the source to sea approach. But what we found is that it was very difficult to make that move from I have my mandate, I have my jurisdiction, which is this municipality. I'm writing an environmental strategy for Hoi An. How can I force anybody up there to do anything? Or I have no authority there. And this is where the longer term process comes in of how do we, first of all, create mechanisms for coordination and conversation and trust building and that shared understanding and vision of where do we want to go, but then how do we use that to unlock the finance that doesn't just keep going to Hoi An because it's such an important place, but goes into those rural areas and coastal areas and helps them have good solid waste management, recycling rates, and therefore reduces the whole plastic pollution issue instead of just in one location.
Martin, perhaps you can share some experiences from your work with a source to sea. And have you come across any holistic approaches that help policymakers, corporates, communities, and investors address some of these challenges we've discussed here today?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so first of all, on the regulatory and kind of the framework side, there's now lots of innovation in terms of coming up with frameworks that work for investors that can really help to implement the source to sea approaches. So now with the EU taxonomy, actually, from I think January next year, water, biodiversity, nature is actually going to be included in the taxonomy. So it's much more difficult for companies, to avoid reporting on those kind of things, like their chemical footprint, the plastics pollution, and other factors, and like, for example, like, the water usage and so on. So it's going to be, there's lots of innovation around this kind of framework setting. Task Force on nature-related financial disclosures is coming. Just on the ocean, which is obviously an area that I'm very much passionate about. There's the sustainable ocean business platform that the UN Global Compact put together that also includes now pollution and so on. So on this kind of framework side, there's lots of innovation, but they're very there are pockets of innovation kind of in the local level as well. Like, for example, for the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, there's now this scheme, which is kind of a reef reward scheme that actually rewards farmers for looking at the kind of pesticides and fertilizers and so on they use, and rewards them for reducing that, because they know that ultimately this will end up in the ocean. So there's this kind of financial incentive program as well. On the corporate side, there's like the likes of DSM, a conglomerate, or in Thailand, Indorama Ventures, and others that are now really kind of reporting about their nature footprint, their water usage, their the plastic pollution, other kind of pollution that they produce. So it's basically a corporate initiative as well. So corporates are now, because they know they have to report on it, but also because they need to have a source to see lens, because it's also beneficial for them, because they become more efficient and so on. And it's also because they have to do it as part of their reporting obligations. So there are lots of innovations. And on the finance side, there's the blue bonds that I mentioned. Also on the corporate side, there are blue bonds are also coming. The Swedish bank SEB, for example, issued a blue bond recently. And there's lots of innovation on that kind of financial product side as well.
All right, you've convinced me about the source-to-sea approach. What needs to happen now to accelerate investment to take more source-to-sea action?
So I mean, take that first.
Yeah, try. It's often difficult to kind of pin it down to the key message. I would say one thing, one is the value chain approach, because as we mentioned, building that trust to really accelerate source to sea, we need to have this value chain approach. We need to almost accept the reality that Scope 3 emissions is something that will be replicated or is already being replicated for nature and pollution. So ultimately, corporates and investors need to be much more aware of their value chain action. And source to sea is all about the value chain. It's all from upstream to downstream. So that is a new reality that companies and investors have to be aware of. And they should make plans for that. And the ones that are early movers will be rewarded for that. Secondly, these companies, they need to be aware of the transition risks. If we move to kind of a zero pollution ocean, which in our Back to Blue program, this is something we look at. We look at chemical pollution, plastic pollution, ocean acidification. If we move towards a zero pollution ocean, we need to look at the transition risks for companies. We need to look at what does this mean for the policy and legal risks? What does it mean for technological risks? What does it mean for reputational risks? If you don't move, what does it mean for your customers? The market risks and so on. So they have to get ready for these kind of risks. And finally, it's all about developing those financial products, new kind of corporate green bonds. I think BASF has recently done that in terms of commissioning bonds to kind of eliminate some of the waste in their supply chains. There's blue bonds that I mentioned, Seychelles, Belize. So it's governments also being involved in this. The carbon, the plastic credits that are very much modeled on carbon credits. All these kind of financial innovation is going to happen and will accelerate because of what we're now seeing with source to sea being seen as a valid approach, as a very promising approach to tackle some of these value chain challenges.
Yes, and maybe for me to just add to that, you might be picking up, he's very much involved with corporates. I work more with, the governments. And so what I see there is that, first of all, we really need to raise the awareness and the recognition and the understanding of the source-to-sea connections, that land, freshwater, coastal and marine and ecosystems are inherently linked, and that we cannot manage them in silos, that we really need to have this holistic approach. And with that holistic approach, that means that we need to break out of working in our silos, that we need to build those relationships of trust and the mechanisms to make decisions together so that we aren't off in our own little tracks, but we are really looking at the whole picture together. And I think finally, it's fundamentally is that to address what I said at the beginning about these crises that are interlinked, we really need to recognize that our lives depend on a healthy planet, a healthy nature. The plants and animals that we share the earth with give us so much benefit that we really need to put that as a priority in terms of our decision-making processes, so that when we're doing these great innovations that Martin has brought in, that we always have in the back of our minds, how can this create a healthier planet? How can this make plants and animals thrive? How can this make it so that people have better lives because we have better nature supporting us with all that it gives us to sustain us and in our lives?
So there's lots of crisis and risk out there, but also opportunities and benefits to be had.
Yes. Yes.
Well, thank you both for joining us here on the talk show and sharing with us your expertise and enthusiasm for Source to See action.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching this session of the talk show. Stay tuned for more episodes throughout the World Water Week.